How did the United States Navy outmaneuver the Japanese at the operational level? We look at the application of joint effects for the Guadalcanal campaign.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Welcome back to another episode of our Guadalcanal campaign with Dave Holland. This is the 17th episode. Today we're following up on the fourth Battle of the Matanikau, the Coley Point Rat Race, and Carlson's Long Patrol. We're looking at what is happening on Guadalcanal in November. These are pivotal events. These are events that are going to shape the remainder of the campaign. It's always difficult to know at what point a campaign is won or lost, but we are very close to the culmination point for the Japanese now. Before we get back to our interview with Dave, I wanted to start with some doctrine. This is US Navy doctrine. It is Naval Doctrine Publication 1, Naval Warfare. And I just want to read out one important definition for you. This is the definition of sea control. Sea control is the condition in which one has freedom of action to use the sea for one's own purposes in specified areas and for specified periods of time, and, where necessary, to deny or limit its use to the enemy. Sea control includes the airspace above the surface of the water volume and seabed below. In some cases, it may also require the control of key maritime terrain to influence events seaward. Key maritime terrain is often associated with coastal areas or islands from which operations can be conducted to control or deny the use of adjacent sea lanes, especially at strategic choke points. Sea control is the manifestation of lethality afloat. Sea control enables all other naval functions. The value of sea control becomes apparent when compared to sea denial, which involves partially or completely denying the adversary the use of the sea. This offensive, cost-imposing approach can be applied when it is impossible or unnecessary to establish sea control. Sea denial is offensive in nature because the attacker chooses the times, places, and targets of attack. The ability to control or deny sea space may also be applied to conduct blockades in wartime or as a mean to control crises. Something to reflect on as we look at sea control, sea denial in the Guadalcanal campaign, and potentially some contemporary naval operations that have been conducted. As we start our look at the final battles of the Guadalcanal campaign, I want you to be thinking about what condition both sides' troops were in, how much ammunition they had supporting each of the battles that they were fighting, and how long the troops had been in the theatre for, and how long would it be before they would be relieved. The book Fleet Tactics and Coastal Combat by Captain Wayne Hughes Jr. has the following to say about the Guadalcanal campaign. In daylight, the United States controlled the air around Henderson Field. The Japanese had the same advantage around Rabaul, New Britain, 600 miles to the northwest. But when the sun set, air power lost its grip and surface combatants met and fought once more. Every night, the Japanese threatened to rush warships south through the narrow waters of the slot between the dual island chains that constituted the Solomons. To the Americans, the enemy warships were the fearsome Tokyo Express, which was bent on delivering reinforcements to Guadalcanal, or a brutal gunnery bombardment to Henderson Field. Whenever American warships tried to stop the Japanese, the result was a lethal surface battle in the blackness of the night. It's important to understand that the Japanese, during the Guadalcanal campaign, on most nights, they owned the night. When we look at the naval campaign component, we will discuss why the Imperial Japanese had the edge often when they were fighting at night, because it's a fascinating story. But for now, just think that when there was naval fighting at night, the Japanese did hold the edge. So what were these pivotal battles? I'm not going to go into them in great detail because there'll be plenty of opportunity to do that further down the track. But I want to just give you a flavour because it's really important when we think about it from the joint effects that are being used to shape the land battle. On the 12th of November, Rear Admiral Kelly Turner arrives with US transports as a part of Task Force 67. As they're unloading troops and supplies, they're attacked by Japanese torpedo bombers. He receives intelligence that there's another bombardment group heading towards Henderson Field. He's responsible for transports. They're still unloading. But I think two things weigh upon his mind. The Navy's already seen the poor results from committing forces in a piecemeal fashion. They need to be able to concentrate force. Also, the target of the bombardment group will be Henderson Field. This is the decisive terrain. It's critically important to maintain the ability of the Cactus Air Force to operate from Henderson Field. He stripped his convoy of the cruisers and destroyers that were protecting it, and he assigned them to Daniel J. Callaghan, who was in the San Francisco. Turner wrote to Callaghan, "It looks this time like the enemy is finally about to make an all-out effort against Cactus. If you can really strike the enemy hard, it will be more important for you to do that than to protect my transports. Good luck to you, Dan. God bless all of you and give you strength." Callaghan's aware of the fact that there are Japanese battleships that are going to be heading down the slot, and it's his job to stop them with cruisers and destroyers. There's a passage in Neptune's Inferno that describes the scene. The officer of the deck for the first dog watch, Lieutenant Jack Bennett, listened to the Admiral conversing with Captain Casson Young as they stood on the starboard bridge wing. The wind carried their voices to me as I paced the deck, and I was able to clearly observe the demeanour of each, Bennett said. They were discussing the unannounced fact that there were battleships in the Tokyo Express. Captain Young was in an understandably agitated state, sometimes waving his arms as he remarked, "This is suicide." Admiral Dan Callaghan replied, "Yes, I know, but we have to do it." As Bennett saw it, Callaghan was calm, unemotional, resolute, and perhaps resigned to his fate. By this time, Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka's third convoy has left Shortland Islands. There's 11 transports carrying the majority of the 38th Division, a lot of ammunition, a lot of food, a lot of heavy equipment, and around 10,000 troops. They are escorted by 13 destroyers. They are heading for Guadalcanal. That bombardment group, their job is to once again degrade the ability of the Cactus Air Force to fly out of Henderson Field. This is really important because this is what's going to enable Tanaka to get his convoy to Guadalcanal to be able to offload and then get back to the Shortlands. If the Cactus Air Force is operational, it's going to be a much riskier mission for him and his precious transports. At 0124, the USS Helena's SG radar detects Abe's bombardment force at a range of 27,000 yards. Callaghan, on the San Francisco, does not have access to SG radar feeds, and it is another 21 minutes before he gives the order to stand by to open fire. What ensues has famously been described as a barroom brawl with the lights turned out. The end result for the US Navy was the loss of 2 cruisers, the Atlanta and Juno, along with 4 destroyers. 2 rear admirals were killed, so Callaghan was killed and Norman Scott. Scott was on the Atlanta, and that was probably as the result of friendly fire from the San Francisco. For the IJN, 2 destroyers were lost. Critically, the battleship Hiei was badly damaged, including damage to its rudder. She was left steaming in a starboard circle in Iron Bottom Sound at around 5 knots. The Japanese cancelled the bombardment of Henderson Field, and the surviving battleship, Kirishima, withdraws. The landing of the troops from the convoy is also postponed, and Tanaka turns his convoy around. During the day of the 13th, the Cactus Air Force and aircraft from the USS Enterprise attack Hiei relentlessly, and she's eventually scuttled. In the afternoon, Tanaka is ordered to turn back once more for Guadalcanal. His convoy must get through. In the early hours of the 14th of November, 2 Japanese cruisers bombard Henderson Field again. They destroy 18 planes, but they don't do enough damage to put the airfield entirely out of operation. US dawn patrols locate the retiring Japanese bombardment group of cruisers, and they're able to sink the heavy cruiser Kunigasa. The location of Tanaka's convoy is also determined, and by late morning, they are starting to be relentlessly attacked. They've got aircraft from Cactus Air Force. They've got aircraft from the USS Enterprise. They've got B-17s from Espiritu Santo attacking them. Halsey is throwing everything that he has got to deny the transports the ability to unload their cargo. 6 transports are sunk, 1 is scuttled, but Tanaka continues on with his 4 surviving ships. With the realization that Henderson Airfield is still operational and that the transports are in significant danger, a new bombardment group is created around the battleship Kirishima under Vice Admiral Kondo, and they are sent back to Henderson Field to cover Tanaka's approach. To parry the latest advance of the Imperial Japanese Navy, Halsey deploys his reserve, his 2 battleships, the South Dakota and the Washington, under Willis Lee. Willis Lee was an expert marksman in multiple ways. He won 5 gold, 1 silver and 1 bronze medal at the 1920 Antwerp Summer Games. That was across Team Free Rifle, Team Small Bore Rifle and the Team Pistol. He was also a marksman with the 9 16-inch guns that the USS Washington was armed with, particularly when used in concert with the SG radar. He was one of the main proponents of radar gunnery. As an escort, the Washington and South Dakota have just 4 destroyers. Lee detects Kondo's force with the radar and opens fire. The South Dakota has multiple catastrophic electrical failures and is unable to fire its guns. The Japanese battleship Kirishima gets a withering fire from the Washington and is crippled and later sinks. Kondo turns the remainder of the bombardment force to the north to withdraw. This leaves Tanaka alone. He knows that he's not going to be able to unload the 4 transports and leave before daylight, so he requests permission and receives it to run the 4 transports aground so that they can be unloaded. At dawn, the transports are visible from American positions. American aircraft, artillery, and the destroyer USS Meade attack the convoys and destroy them. Many of the stores have been gotten off onto the beach, which is where they are destroyed. So all 11 of the transports have been either sunk or beached. Just how effective was the convoy in resupplying the troops on Guadalcanal? Let's get back into our interview with Dave Holland and the analysis that he's done about just how effective this convoy was.
4 managed to make it through, and like you said, they beached it. There's been a lot of errors or misconception on how many actually died. You see the reports of 7,000, which isn't correct. It was 7,000 troops on those transport ships. But when I looked in my book, and then Richard Frank, he basically supports it too, and there's been a couple others. But my book, when I looked at the Japanese records, there were at least 2,000 Japanese that landed from those 4 transports. Now, albeit, those 2,000 that landed, and we're talking about infantry troops, most of them without weapons. There were like 1 or 2 days of supplies, food landed, hardly no ammunition. And what ammunition and stuff that actually landed on the beach, the American Cactus Air Force just blasted it. And one guy, flyer, said it was like an inferno up and down the beach of just burning cargo. So basically, these guys, 2,000 men, just turned out to be probably just maybe supply carriers. That's about the only thing they could do. But there were more mouths to feed, then they really couldn't do anything. They couldn't throw them straight into the offensive. So that basically stopped the Japanese hopes for their third offensive, or their second large offensive of the thing. Didn't stop their hopes. They just said, okay, well, now we just need to go, just wait for the next attempt, which they were at that stage looking to be late December, January for another attempt. They wasn't giving up. It just really threw us wrench in their gears, so to speak.
And I think that's an important point because the campaign is still from the American side, there's still significant doubts. Halsey goes all in to support the troops on the ground. He commits everything to the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. They put battleships into the slot, which is the last place where they want to fight. He does that because he doesn't have any aircraft carriers. He's run out of aircraft carriers. So it's a fairly pivotal moment in the campaign, isn't it?
Yes. Like I said, it's some people say it's the turning point of the campaign. Once again, I'm a land guy. Reading reports and just knowing what I know, after the battle, the big naval battles, those poor grunts on the Port Cruz line looked out and said, oh yeah, we defeated them at sea. But then they looked across 200 yards across and they go, well, we still got to dig these Japanese out of the hole. We still got to fight. Battle is far from over. What I'm saying after that is like, okay, we're going to win now. But it did give the Americans a bit of hope. In fact, you read some accounts, I think Puller and a few others said this is the first time in the campaign they actually thought we could actually win here. There's a chance we're going to win. Not like it's already said and done. It's a slam dunk victory already. It's like, okay, well now things are starting to turn to look in our favor for a change. Because you remember in October was a low point, especially for the American public. They thought, well, the American politicians were setting it up for the Marines to actually fail, setting the public up, not Marines to fail, setting the public up for a potential Marine surrender or failure of Guadalcanal.
And critically, the Japanese High Command, the Japanese on Guadalcanal, they are still thinking around how they're going to evict the American forces from Guadalcanal. They haven't given up either, have they?
No, Hakataki was like, okay, we just suffered a major setback here, but we have to hold. And he gave an army command. He's basically said, look, I forgot exactly what he says. I got him a book, exact quote, but like went along the lines that, look, it's easy to die in a glorious charge, but it's a lot harder to hold out in a miserable, he said it's a lot harder to survive in a miserable holding out action. I beg you, men, I'm calling upon you to do this. And, he talks about the emperor and, divine gods and everything else. But he said, this is what we have to do. We have to hold because reinforcements are coming. And the biggest thing, that the promised air reinforcements are coming, because everybody, even the lowest private, knew that we have to suppress this American air. If we don't take out the air, we're not going to win. And that was that was the big thing, that the promised reinforcements were coming in. 2 more divisions were coming in. All these fighter squadrons were coming down south. More airfields being built closer, like in Munda and a few other, in Buin, Munda, and other places in Solomon Islands, to bring the fighter coverage closer, not the 600 miles away, in Rabaul. So yeah, that was everything was being promised to them, but they knew they had to suppress that American air power before they could do anything. They knew that from early October. They had to destroy the airfield or suppress the airfield to win.
And this is why I think that the airfield, the unsinkable aircraft carrier, is the decisive terrain of the campaign. The success of the campaign requires the retention or seizure of the airfield.
Aerial denial. I mean, during the days we talked about before, it denied the Japanese from landing lawless supplies, more men during the day on those large transports. The only thing they could do is send those fast destroyers at night in and out, but they were very limited in what they carried. Yeah, the Japanese logistics wasn't that great. They weren't great logistic planners. They had a lot of supplies, but it was back in their bound, building up. They just couldn't, there was a bottleneck there. They just couldn't get it to the island because of the American air power, which sink everything they had during the day.
So we're talking around mid-November now. What's the state of the Japanese troops? How many of them are there? And for the average Japanese soldier, what is life like on Guadalcanal?
Right. There was still roughly around 20,000 Japanese there. And they were kind of on par with Americans. But those 20,000, I have to do it off the top of my head, but I've got them for different weeks. But I think by the time late November came, I know that there's probably about 13,000 effective. The rest of them were sick. When I say sick, I'm talking about malaria, dengue fever. Some of them were starting to go into the first stages of starvation. As you know, there's difference between being hungry and starving. They were actually reaching the first stages of starvation. So their last resupply, big resupply, was in mid-October. So we're looking at this stage a month, and they were basically on short rations then, and that's why they were really holding out to this November. And then you can imagine when their great hopes in the November resupply just sunk or diminished or burned on the beach, that really put a lot of them in despair. And then that's when you see them really start to go downhill. Physically, yes. And then the big factor, especially for the Japanese mindset, you're starting to see their minds starting to go down, or their hope, or the Japanese, I don't never use the word fanatical, but their determined mindset, it's starting to erode a bit. They're starting to question some of their superiors. You read it in their diaries at the time, what you never seen before. So the victory fever was long gone by then. And they're starting to saying this is a miserable place and we're all just going to starve to death. I've got to watch my buddies starve and die in front of me. So yeah, it wouldn't. But once again, they wasn't giving up. And if they could just lay there and pull the trigger and die in place, they would. And that's what they did.
And the thing that's interesting, I think, at this part of the campaign is that we're seeing a dramatic change where you've got the despair on the Japanese side. The supply situation for the US forces is getting better, isn't it? What's the dispositions around sort of mid-November? Where are we looking at with the Americans? So the 1st Marines, they've been there for quite a while now. What are they looking like? And what's being done to manage that?
Yeah, so in November, you had a number of American resupplies come in. So on the supply front, things looking better. Major General Harmon, which is Army Commander of South Pacific, Americans had a big bottleneck at New Caledonia, supply bottleneck too. So at that stage, it had been worked out. They brought there's a supply expert, a genius in from the U.S. Army to come in and sort some stuff out. So they standardized a few things, shipping. But anyway, they got the supplies up and running. So the supply line was running quite well by November. That's when you seen the 1st Marine Division, who were very sick and tired and worn out. They're at that stage, they're starting to replace their raggedy clothes, and they were getting replacements, or getting some solid food for a change, getting better medical treatment, and allowed to get some PX supplies, in like razor blades and candy or lollies, as they say in Australia. So and some mail. The mail was really starting to come in. So it's starting to life was actually looking a bit achievable. Even though there was no rest area in Guadalcanal. I mean, if you go back to the rear, you're still getting smashed by some artillery and air raids. But yeah, things were looking up a lot better for the Marines. Once again, the 1st Marine Division was worn out, sick, very tired, a lot of them suffering from malaria. When they left, there's 8,000 of them, 8,000 malaria cases. So there's time for them to leave. They're offensively spent. They weren't in no shape to do an offensive after that.
So that brings us to the 5th Battle of the Matanikau. So a resumption of the push over to the West Bank with the intent of reaching Cochabamba, which is a pivotal, for starters, the Japanese headquarters for Guadalcanal is at Cochabamba, as well as there's a lot of supplies there as well. Do you want to talk us through the planning for 5th Matanikau, as well as, what was the intelligence picture? What did they know about? Because the American forces have been there for quite a while now. What was the intelligence picture like?
Yeah, so they knew the Japanese had landed a fresh unit, the 228th Regiment, other 38th. They'd landed them in that first week in November. And they was actually preliminary, the big convoy, but they landed them there over several nights through fast destroyers. So they had a fresh regiment there. They knew the Japanese, there was a fresh regiment there. They didn't know exactly where they were. And they knew the Japanese wasn't on the western bank of Matanikau. And that was correct because the Marines, the 8th Marines was on the eastern part. So when they pulled back, they left the 8th Marines holding the east bank of Matanikau. So they had been doing patrols and things like that on the other bank. So they knew the Japanese wasn't there. So they figured the Japanese had pulled all the way back to the Cochabamba area around some ridges. So, because they wasn't hitting any Japanese. A few screen forces and patrols, but nothing serious. But what the Japanese had done, of course, they didn't leave their guys on the bank because they knew that would be, they call it artillery fodder. Anybody they left there would be smashed by American artillery. So what they did, they left some dummy positions and some screening forces. What the Japanese had done, they pulled back 2,000 yards to around the Point Cruz area, around the ridge lines. And we talked about it in the other episodes about the ravine there. The Marines are very familiar with it, but that's a natural choke point on Hill 80, 84, 83. Then the Marines had Hill 78, but there was a ravine and a natural choke point about 400 yards. That choke point was about 400 yards from the ocean to the base of Hill 84. And that was where the government track went across. So that was a natural defensive position. And it went another 2,000 yards straight to the south. So there was a good defensive position. And what the Japanese had done, they went in there and dug reverse slope positions. They've dug down into the ravine. all these coral igloos that the Americans finally called them, but coral bunkers, real highly camouflaged. They had them in machine guns, those top 96s and 99 fast-firing machine guns. And that was the basis of their defense. And they had them in supporting positions, like a little 5 shape. And then the areas not covered by those machine guns. They're covered with the top 89 grenade launchers, which we call knee mortars, and riflemen, quote, snipers, which, that's what they called them, snipers, not their modern school trained top snipers, but the areas that the Americans couldn't get. And plus they had the Japanese had anti-tank guns and the machine guns enfiladed straight down the ravine. I mean, they were digging little holes in the side of the ravine. They put one man in, and then like a big ditch, they'd put one guy in the ditch and in little holes where they'd fire diagonally. And the only way you can get them is actually, you can't shoot them directly on, you got to get them diagonally. And when you're trying to get them diagonally, another one get you enfiladed. And they had put them in trees. They put firing platforms. When I first read about machine guns in trees, I'm like, what? But yeah, they had like little wooden platforms that put these Japanese top 96 machine guns in trees. So they had them. There was a very tight position, strong position. And they had the remnants of the 2nd Division dug in there. And they had some of these fresh units of the 228 a bit inland too. So they had some fresh Japanese in there. And plus they were all supported by this Japanese 100 millimeter and 150 millimeter, quote, collective pistol big guns, and some Japanese 90 millimeter mortar. So it's a very strong position. That was but the Americans didn't know that. They know that. They didn't know the Japanese were that close to the Matanikau in such a strong position. And then, so you talking about the planning?
Yeah, so what was the plan for 5th Matanikau?
Yeah, so at this stage, like I said earlier, the 1st Marine Division was spent offensively. They were just waiting to get relieved. So the Marikau Division was starting to come in. So we know we had the 164th Regiment there, and they had been attached to the 1st Marine Division. So they were attached. But you had Major General Alexander Patch. So they're in New Caledonia. They had started to arrive. The Marikau Division staff, General Edmund Seabury, I think we talked about him, a Brigadier General. He was the division's assistant commander, and he was involved in Coley Point. I think we mentioned him. So they sent Seabury west to the Matanikau to take over the western sector. So at that stage, Vandegrift's unit had grown to corps size. So he's had his Brigadier General, one Brigadier General take charge to the east, another Brigadier General take charge to the west. And then the Marines were starting to do a bit of a handover in the planning phases. So the Marikau's division staff had arrived like 2 days before the attack date. And the Marines basically handed over. They go, well, this is the Army. We're letting you plan this. We're doing a handover. And by the way, you can plan it. So you can imagine division staff had landed 2 days before. The front man looked at them out, and they go, oh, you're planning the next large offensive. In fact, it was going to be one of the largest offensive ever done by the Americans. So Seabury was going to be in charge. Patch hadn't arrived on the island yet. He was supposed to come in on the 19th. So the attack was going to kick off on the 17th. So the plan of action was they had the 182nd National Guard unit had just arrived from the New England area, National Guard, 2 battalions of them. And they'd only been on the island a week. So they're going to remember, the American intelligence said there was no really strong forces on the Matanikau. So it was like a typical U.S. Army set-piece battle. Rather than doctrine, what they were going to do was send the 182nd, brand new unit, 6 days, never been in combat before, 6 days on the island. They were going to send them over the river first to move in 2,000 yards conveniently to the Point Cruz line, exactly where the Japanese had main defense line, which Americans didn't know. And there they were going to set up defensive positions. Once they set up defensive position, they were going to hold. And then the Americans were going to move over, establish supply dump, bring up some artillery battalions closer. And then they'd have the 8th Marines and potentially the 164th. Once they had a nice set, ready to go area, a bit of maneuvering room to the left, then they're going to send the 8th Marines and the 164th straight through the 182nd lines and push all the way to Cucambona. Almost like they did in 11th of November, if you remember. They almost they were 1,000 yards from Cucambona. So that's where they thought the Japanese were still at, which, a couple of miles down. So that was the plan. So that was going to start on the 17th. They had the first one battalion was going to go over on the 18th and see some of the high ground on Hill 66 to add a bit of maneuvering room to spread out the room. So they was looking at a potential envelopment along the hills to bypass any choke points on the coast. And Seabury was going to do it. And once again, it was going to be a massive artillery bombardment, straight out of Army doctrine, preceded by air support, massive artillery bombardment, 155 millimeter guns, 105s and 75s, with dropping of a lot of air support all along the lines, prepping the area, and then they were going to push out, hold it, phase it. So that was the plan.
We'll leave it there. Once again, a big thank you to Dave for the work that he's done in telling the story of the land campaign at Guadalcanal. Just a couple of thoughts from me. Both navies have risked a lot in the conduct of naval operations around Guadalcanal in order to ensure that their troops are supplied. The interesting thing is the IJN often coming up victorious tactically, but unable to still get those supplies through when needed. This is the third big convoy that they tried to get through. Its failure would have ramifications for the rest of the campaign. One last reflection on an operational level. Remember Hayakatake, commander of the 17th Army, so he's responsible for Guadalcanal, the Solomon Islands, and New Guinea up until recently. The 38th Division, up until recently, before its deployment into Guadalcanal, had been earmarked for operations in New Guinea. Just imagine how much more difficult the Battle of the Beaches would have been had another 7,000 troops been landed along with their heavy equipment. That would have put the Japanese up to almost parity with the Allied forces that were attacking them. The Allies suffered 1,991 killed and 12,300 injured or sick in the Battle of the Beaches of Buna and Gona. Had the 38th Division deployed into that area, those casualties would have been a lot higher. Not only that, the tempo, the effort to try and regain the initiative would have been slowed. With that, we will leave it, and next episode we'll be back to look at the 5th Battle of the Matanikau.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.